The first thing Lila Red Willow buried was not a body. It was a wagon. A heavy railroad survey wagon, black with tar, split at one wheel, abandoned at the edge of a little Kansas settlement because the men who owned it said it was useless. To everyone else, it looked like junk. To Lila, it looked like the only wall the wind could not learn how to kill. She was 62 years old, Otoe by birth, narrow in the shoulders, strong in the hands, and quiet in the dangerous way that made impatient people think she had nothing to say. She had crossed the Smoky Hill grasslands with 2 grandchildren, 1 horse, $3 in coin, and a boy who coughed so hard at sunrise that red threads appeared in the cloth she held to his mouth. His name was Noah. He was 7. His sister, Elsie, was 12 and old enough to understand what adults tried to hide. Winter was coming, and the town had decided Lila was not building shelter. The town said she was digging a grave. Prairie Bend was not much of a town in October of 1879. It was a strip of flattened grass beside a freight road, 6 plank cabins with rooflines too proud for the wind, a store with 1 finished wall and 3 promises, a blacksmith shed, and a schoolhouse, whose windows rattled even when the air was calm. There were no trees worth cutting. There was no stone worth hauling without a team. There was no hill high enough to hide behind. There was only grass, sky, and the long open mile between them. That was the part the newcomers kept misunderstanding. They looked at the prairie and saw emptiness. Lila looked at it and saw a force with room to gather speed. The land agent in Prairie Bend was a man named Tobias Gray. He owned the lumber stack behind the store. He held the town notes in his ledger. He wore a wool coat even when he was indoors, because it made him look like a man who could afford weather. Gray had already noticed the broken survey wagon lying half in the roadside wash east of town. It had belonged to a railroad survey crew that had moved on in August after snapping an axle crossing a dry creek bed. The wagon was built like a small room on wheels, 9 feet of oak floor, tarred sideboards, no glass, no comfort. But the frame had been made to carry chains, tripods, boxes of instruments, and iron stakes over country that punished anything light. Gray posted a salvage notice on it, 7 days. If no owner produced a paper claim, the wagon would be stripped for boards and sold. He nailed the notice high, where Lila had to look up to read it. Then he said, "You can sleep beside it until the auction. After that, it belongs to the town." Lila did not ask who the town was. In Prairie Bend, the town usually meant Tobias Gray. She looked past him, toward the shallow wash where the wagon sat. Then she asked one question. "How far below the grass does the wind stop cutting?" Gray stared at her. The question offended him more than an insult would have. He told her again that she had 7 days. Then he rode back toward the store, where he could explain to men with sawdust on their sleeves that the old Indian woman was talking to ditches now. The carpenter came the next morning. His name was Martin Hollis, and he had built 2 houses in Missouri, 3 in Kansas, and enough fences to believe that anything worth sheltering inside had to stand upright. He walked around the survey wagon with a hammer in one hand and disappointment on his face. He kicked the broken wheel. He pressed the tarred boards. He looked down into the wash. Then he gave Lila his verdict without being asked for one. "This is a box," he said. He meant it as a finishing blow. A box with a cracked axle, no stove collar, no window, and no room for a family. You cannot live through a plains winter in a box. Lila was packing cornmeal into a tin when he said it. She kept packing. Hollis pointed at the cabins across the road. "A house needs posts, braces, rafters, a roof pitch, boards tight enough to keep out the weather. You need a stove, pipe, chinking, glass, and nails, not a hole." Lila looked up then. "Your west wall sings," she said. Hollis stopped. She nodded toward the newest cabin, the one he had framed 3 days earlier. When the wind turns north, the boards hum at the seam near the corner, not loud, but enough. The apprentice standing behind him looked at the cabin. So did the homesteader who had slowed his mule on the road. Hollis's ears reddened. That seam is temporary. Wind does not know temporary, Lila said. He left after that, but his words had done their work. A proper cabin needed materials Lila did not have. A proper cabin needed credit she would not be given. A proper cabin needed time Noah's lungs were not likely to spare. And the one thing she did have, the broken survey wagon, had 7 days before Gray stripped it board by board. That night, Noah coughed until Elsie cried with her face turned away so he would not see. Lila held the boy against her ribs and listened, not just to him, to the weather. The air had changed. It had the dry iron taste she remembered from storms that came without rain. Birds had gone quiet before sundown for 4 days. The grass lay in the same direction every morning, as if a great hand had combed it while the town slept. And the wind, when it rose, came flat from the northwest. Not gusting. Gathering. The settlers called that kind of worry superstition. Lila called it memory. When she was a girl, her aunt had repaired earth lodge walls after spring storms. The lodge had not stood against the wind like a plank house. It had lowered itself into the ground and carried weight. Willow ribs, grass, clay, sod. The kind of building that did not impress a man from Missouri because it did not announce itself from the road. Her aunt had taught by sound. She knocked on exposed timber. It rang. Then she knocked on the packed earth wall. It answered with a dead, solid thud. Wind spends itself on what it can reach, her aunt had said. Earth does not argue. Earth holds. Lila had not known then that the lesson would wait in her for 50 years. She only knew the sound. Ring meant hollow. Thud meant held. The idea returned to her not as inspiration, but as a horse backing into safety. 3 days after Holly laughed at the wagon, a hard gust struck the road and sent a bucket rolling end over end toward the store. Lila was leading her horse, Blue Ash, back from the creek. The old horse did not bolt. He stepped backward into the wash where the wagon sat, lowered his head, and stood with his shoulders below the grass line. Above him, dust sliced sideways at eye level. Below the lip of the wash, the air trembled but did not cut. Lila crouched beside him. She raised one hand above the wash. The wind slapped grit into her palm. She lowered it. Stillness, not calm, but shelter. The wash was only 4 feet deep. Hollis had seen a shallow ditch. Lila saw the beginning of a room. If the survey wagon stayed above ground, it was a box. If it went below ground, tarred boards against clay, roof flush with sod, seams sealed with fat and mud, it became something else, not a cabin, not a cellar, a wind blind, a place the storm could pass over without ever finding a wall. The trench would need to be longer than the wagon, wider by 2 feet on both sides, deep enough that the roof sat below the prairie surface, a ramp on the east side, away from the hard wind, a stone sump in the low corner, 2 bent stovepipes for air, no taller than a badger mound, interior posts to carry the roof load down into the floor, no glass, no proud wall, no pitch, nothing for the wind to seize. Every part of it could fail. Dig too shallow, and the roof edge would lift. Dig too deep, and water would pool. Seal the vents wrong, and the shelter would choke the people it saved. Overload the roof, and it would bury them alive. Lila understood every danger. Then she picked up the mattock and began. By the second morning, the town had a new joke. Red Willow's grave. Men said it at the store stove. Children repeated it in the road because children borrow cruelty before they understand its weight. Even Elsie heard it when she carried creek water back in a kettle. She did not tell Lila. She only gripped the kettle harder and spilled less. Peter Lamb, a farmer with a pregnant wife and 2 cows, came to the wash on the fourth day. He stood above the trench while Lila broke clay and Elsie carried clods in a feed sack. "What happens when rain fills it?" he asked. Lila pointed to a small test cut she had made beside the main trench. "Pour," she said. Elsie poured a bucket of creek water at the high end. The water ran along the packed clay slope and disappeared into a little pit lined with flat stones. Peter watched it gather there. "That is one bucket," he said. "Rain is many buckets. Water does not change its mind because there is more of it," Lila said. "It still goes down." He looked at the survey wagon. "What happens when the roof falls in?" Lila laid a plank across the test cut and piled sod on it until the board bowed. Then she wedged a trimmed cottonwood post beneath the middle. The bowing stopped. "The roof is not asked to be brave," she said, "only to pass weight to the post. The post passes it to the ground." Peter did not laugh. He did not help either. But when he walked away, he looked back 3 times. Gray worked faster than doubt. At the store that evening, he told anyone listening that Lila was teaching families to live like burrowing animals. He said it with care, because he knew exactly where the insult landed. The settlers had come west to stand on land and call it theirs. They wanted walls, windows, painted trim, a roof that told the road a family had risen. A room underground felt like surrender. It felt poor. It felt native. It felt like everything they were trying to prove they had left behind. Gray sold more than boards. He sold the shape of being civilized. And Lila was proving that shape could kill. The man who understood first was not from Prairie Bend. He arrived at dusk on the 5th day, walking with a bedroll over one shoulder and a block and tackle wrapped in canvas against his hip. His name was Silas Ward. He was black, 56, long-armed, gray at the beard, and watchful in the way men become when they have spent years doing necessary work for people who pretend not to see them. He had driven freight for the Army after the war. He had hauled bridge timbers for survey crews. He knew wagons by the music their joints made under load. Silas came to the edge of the trench and looked at the broken survey wagon. Then he looked at the corners Lila had staked in clay. "You are not guessing," he said. Lila rested both hands on the mattock. "No." He stepped down into the trench. He measured the diagonal from one corner to the other with Lila's cord. Then he measured the opposite diagonal. 2 inches off, he said. Lila's face did not change, but Elsie saw her jaw tighten. Silas drove one stake inward, pulled the cord again, and measured. "Roof goes flush, corners matter," he said. "A 2-inch gap becomes a door when the wind wants in." Lila nodded once. She did not thank him. He did not ask to be thanked. He picked up the mattock and began to dig beside her. Silas changed the speed of the work because he changed the method. He showed Lila how to read gravel, not fight it. He lengthened the ramp because steep ground kills people carrying children in the dark. He helped cut sod blocks clean, root side down, so they could lock together on the roof like living shingles. He showed Elsie how to test a floor slope by pouring water and watching where it hesitated. If water pooled before the sump, the floor was wrong, not almost right, wrong. 3 hours could be lost correcting half an inch. 3 lives could be lost ignoring it. Then came the hard part. The wagon had to come off its wheels. The survey body weighed nearly 1,000 pounds. The town watched from a distance as Lila, Silas, Elsie, and the old horse prepared to move it sideways and lower it 7 feet into the trench. Hollis came only to shake his head. "If that body twists, the boards will split," he said. Silas wiped mud from his hands. "That is why we lower it as a body, not as a wagon." Hollis frowned. Silas pointed beneath the frame. "Wheels put the weight on 4 points, axles bend, joints fight. Take the wheels off, crib the body flat, lower by layers, and the weight stays where you put it." Hollis understood the sentence even if he did not like the speaker. His eyes followed the cribbing. Alternating rails, cottonwood shims, rope through the iron block, the old horse on the pull line, a brake timber ready to jam the stack if the load jumped. It was not a hole, it was engineering made out of scrap. The lowering began before sunrise on the last day before the auction. Silas gave the commands. Lila held the brake timber. Elsie watched the rope fibers. Blue Ash leaned into the harness, slow and trembling. The wagon body moved 1 inch. Then 2. The crib groaned. "Hold," Silas said. Lila drove the brake timber into the gap. The wagon stopped. Silas pulled 1 rail from the lowest layer. The body dropped 4 inches and settled. Again, pull, hold, drop, again. Each movement was small enough to trust, large enough to terrify. The front edge passed over the trench. Below it waited the floor Lila had graded with split palms, the sump Elsie had lined with creek stones, the walls packed with clay, and the empty space where Noah might sleep without wind tearing through his lungs. Then the side rope screamed. Elsie saw it first. Grandmother, the rope had been sliced, not frayed, cut, then knotted again where someone hoped no one would notice until it took weight. Lila knew whose knife had done it before the thought finished forming. There was no time for anger. The wagon was already moving. The rope began to separate. "Cut it," Silas said. The old plan was gone. A failing rope under strain could whip hard enough to blind a person. Lila drew her knife. For 1 second, every person watching from the road held the same breath. Then she cut. The rear of the wagon swung 6 inches, dropped onto the lower crib, and struck the supports with a sound like thunder under the ground. Dust flew. Elsie flattened herself against the trench wall. Silas went down on 1 knee. Lila did not move until the dust thinned. The wagon body was in the trench, crooked, alive. Silas laughed once, breathless. "We lost the rope." Lila pressed her palm against the oak sideboard. "We kept the room." That afternoon, while Tobias Gray prepared his auction notice, Lila and Silas leveled the wagon with wedges. They checked the roof with a tin cup half full of water. They laid sod across the top. They smeared clay into seams. Peter Lamb's wife, Greta, came at dusk with a crock of rendered beef fat and strips of worn canvas. "My mother sealed cellar seams this way," she said. She put the crock down and left before the road could see her helping. By lantern light, Lila mixed fat into clay until it shone dark and heavy. She packed it into every seam where the wagon met earth. Canvas over clay, clay over canvas, sod over all. The roof disappeared into the prairie 1 palm width at a time. The vent pipes came last. 2 bent sections of stovepipe, angled low, packed tight at the base. Lila lit a candle inside and held it below the pipe. The flame leaned, air moved, the shelter breathed. Noah climbed down the ramp holding Elsie's hand. He stood in the tar-smelling darkness, surrounded by clay and oak and the heavy, warm dampness of earth. He took 1 breath, then another. No cough. He looked at Lila with the seriousness of a child who knows something enormous has happened but not how to name it. "It is not loud in here," he said. Lila placed her hand on the wall. Outside, the ordinary wind combed the grass. Inside, the wall answered with a thud. The auction failed because there was nothing left to auction. The wagon was under earth. Gray stood over the sod roof with his boots in the mud, and his mouth tightened into a line. He could strip boards from a wagon. He could not profit from digging one out of a working shelter without looking foolish in front of the same men he had been trying to control. "If it kills anyone," he said, "it will be on your head." Lila smoothed clay around a vent pipe. "No," she said, "it will be on the person who ignored the sky." The sky answered 2 mornings later, not with thunder, with silence. Lila woke before dawn because the prairie had stopped speaking. No grass whisper, no insects, no creak from the store sign. Even the horse stood still with his head low, ears turned northwest. The air pressed against Lila's eardrums. The western horizon was black without rain beneath it, a hard wall of dust and cold moving toward them faster than any wagon. She went door to door. She told them to come underground. Bring water, bring blankets, bring the children. Some listened through cracked doors and said nothing. Some looked at her as if she had mistaken fear for knowledge. Hollis told her his cabins had braces. Gray did not open his door at all. Peter Lamb did. He looked at the sky. Then he looked at Greta, 8 months pregnant, sitting on the bed with one hand on her belly. How much time, he asked. Not enough to argue, Lila said. He woke the children. The first blast struck at 10 in the morning. It did not sound like wind at first. It sounded like something vast dragging a blade across the edge of the world. The pressure hit before the dust. Doors jumped in their frames. The schoolhouse windows burst inward. A plank flew from the store roof and speared into the mud where a man had been standing 5 seconds earlier. Then the full gale arrived. It did not gust. It stayed. A hard, continuous northwest wind driving sand, ice, and torn grass at chest height until the road disappeared 10 steps from the door. Above ground, Prairie Bend began to come apart by seams. Hollis's newest cabin held for 11 minutes. Then the wind found the singing west wall. It pushed through the unchinked gap, got behind the boards, and peeled the wall outward 1 plank at a time. The roof lifted next. Not because the house was weak, because it gave the wind surfaces. The store false front went all at once, spinning east like a painted sail. Gray's ledger pages tore through the open wall and scattered across the prairie, debts flying where debtors could watch them vanish. Below ground, the survey wagon did not move. The gale pressed downward on the sod cap, and the weight tightened the seal. The walls did not shake. The roof props carried load into the floor. The wind that had 1,000 edges above the grass became a muffled animal overhead, roaring without teeth. Lila sat with Noah against her side and Elsie beside the candle. Silas crouched near the entrance, one hand on the brace timber. Peter, Greta, and their 2 children had arrived minutes before the storm closed the road. 9 people in a room built for 5. The air was close, but it moved. Then the pounding came. Not from the wind, from the hatch. Elsie froze. Silas looked at Lila. Opening the hatch could break the seal. Opening the hatch could fill the room with grit. Opening the hatch could kill the candle, clog the vents, and turn shelter into panic. The pounding came again. Then a voice, shredded by wind. Hollis! Lila opened the hatch. The gale struck her face so hard it drove blood from one nostril. She reached into flying grit and found cloth, then hair, then a man's collar. Silas grabbed the weight behind her and pulled. Martin Hollis fell down the ramp with his left arm twisted close to his ribs and his apprentice behind him, half blind from dust. The hatch slammed shut. Lila drove the brace timber home. The seal held. Hollis was shaking. His mouth was full of dirt. For a long moment he stared at the curved inside wall of the survey wagon he had called a box. Then he shut his eyes. More came after him. A girl from the schoolhouse, the blacksmith's wife. 2 boys who had crawled along the drainage ditch because standing upright meant being thrown. By noon, 13 people were packed inside the buried wagon. The candle burned low. Every breath mattered. That was when the west vent stopped whispering. Lila heard the change before she saw the flame. The vent pipe had gone quiet. The candle shrank, blue at the center, leaning hard toward the only open draft. Silas touched the pipe, blocked. Wind-driven mud had packed the outside elbow. No adult could reach through the bend. No one could go out. 13 people in one sealed room had less time than anyone wanted to count. Lila looked at Elsie. The girl was pressed between Greta's son and the wagon wall, eyes wide but dry. Your arm is small enough, Lila said. Elsie nodded before Lila finished. The tool was ready because Lila had feared this exact failure. A length of fence wire bent into a hook. Elsie fed it into the pipe. The wire struck mud. She pushed. It bent. She changed the angle. Her wrist scraped the pipe edge. Blood ran down her hand. She pushed again, hooked the plug, and pulled. Mud and grass fell onto the floor. Cold air poured through the pipe. The candle lifted, straightened, burned. Nobody cheered. They were too busy breathing. The gale lasted 8 hours. When it ended without mercy. One moment the world roared. The next, silence fell so hard that the children began to cry. Lila opened the hatch at dawn. The town was not destroyed evenly. That was the lesson. The ground was still there. The low things were still there. The things that had stood up to be seen lay in one direction. East, cabin walls, roof planks, shingles, a bed frame driven into the road, the store front in the grass. Hollis's cabin floor was bare, its walls scattered across a quarter mile. Gray's office had lost its roof and half its sign, but the buried survey wagon was only a low, dark rectangle of clay in the prairie. The vent pipes tilted. The ramp was packed with grit. The roof held. 13 people climbed out alive. Greta Lamb still carried her unborn child. Noah breathed without the tearing cough. Hollis stood with one arm bound to his chest and stared at the sod cap. For a long time, he said nothing. Then he knelt, pressed his good hand to the roof and listened. No ring, only the dull answer of weight. I built walls for the wind to find, he said. Everyone heard him because the storm had taken away all other noise. She gave it nothing. After that, questions came quietly. Not apologies. Not at first. Questions. How deep for 5 people? How far apart for roof posts? Where does the sump go if the claim slopes south? How low can a vent pipe sit before snow seals it? Could a shelter be dug under a cabin floor? Could a schoolhouse have one? Could a woman in labor use one if a blizzard came? Lila answered with dirt, water, and tools. She did not give the same measurement twice if the ground was different. She drove stakes into clay and pulled them out to show whether the soil held. She poured buckets to show where water lied. She made men crawl their own ramps carrying sacks of cornmeal before she allowed them to call the grade safe. Silas taught rope, cribbing, and load. Hollis, after the swelling in his arm went down, came with a carpenter's pencil and a notebook. At first he only watched. Then he corrected one roof span. Then Lila corrected his sump. By winter, they were arguing like people who respected the same danger. 18 inches between beams, Hollis said. More support. 22, Lila said. More shelters. 22 breaks. 18 leaves the Weber children with no roof at all. Silas listened, then tapped the notebook. 20, he said. Hollis scowled. Lila thought. Then she nodded. 20 became the number. Not because it was perfect. Because survival on the prairie was never built from perfection. It was built from enough, spread as far as enough could go. Gray tried to sell what he could not stop. He drew a storm cellar plan on clean paper, copied Lila's sump, copied her vent angles badly, and offered the plan for $2. He said proper underground rooms needed milled lumber, iron hinges, tarred canvas, and his supervision. Lila did not argue in the store. She did not accuse him. She walked outside on Sunday after church, sat on an overturned nail keg, and drew a shelter cross-section in the dirt with a stick. 11 people gathered, then 18. She explained every part. The roof did not fight wind. The roof carried weight. The posts did not decorate the room. They carried load. The sump was not a hole for convenience. It was where water was told to wait. The vents were not chimneys. They were lungs, and the entrance had to open inward, because a prairie wind can hold an outward door shut with the strength of 6 men. She charged nothing. When Greta tried to pay her in eggs, Lila kept 2 for Noah and handed the basket back. "Teach the next woman," she said, that was all. Silas did not live to see the 3rd winter. The cold settled in an old injury in his hip, then in his chest. He moved into the original wagon shelter because below ground the air stayed steady and damp. There, he could breathe a little easier. On his last good day, he placed his block and tackle in Lila's hands. The iron was cold. The rope smelled of hemp, mud, and years of labor. "You know where the weight goes now," he said. Lila closed her fingers around it. He was not giving her a tool. He was giving her his place in the work. Silas Ward died before sunrise 2 weeks later. While wind moved over the sod roof and could not touch him, they buried him near the creek bend where the grass grew low and tough. Noah put a stone on the grave. Elsie tied a scrap of rope around the top branch of a cottonwood sapling. Hollis stood with his hat in his hand. Lila said nothing because some debts are too large for words, and some names survive better in what people build than in what they say. By the next spring, Prairie Bend had changed shape. A stranger might have missed it. He would still see cabins, the store, the schoolhouse, smoke from chimneys, children crossing the road. But someone who knew where to look would see the real town under the grass. Low rectangles of sod beside each claim. Vent pipes no higher than animal burrows. East-facing ramps. Clay seams renewed after every rain. Shovels kept inside, not outside. Every shelter had a sump. Every family knew how to test the air with a candle. Every child knew that when the sky turned green-black, you went down before you looked around. The final test came in March. A storm formed after noon, too warm for the season and too fast for comfort. The schoolhouse shelter was unfinished because Gray had delayed the digging with fees, objections, and arguments over who owned the ground under a public building. The trench was there. The roof was not. 14 children were inside the schoolhouse when the sky turned the color of old bruises. Lila was mending a seam on the lamb shelter when the pressure changed in her ears. She stood. Then she ran. 63 years old, one hip stiff from winter, lungs burning, block and tackle striking her thigh. She ran across 300 yards of open grass. The teacher had frozen at his desk. The windows were trembling. The children were staring at him because children look first to the adult who is supposed to know. Lila did know. "Into the trench," she said. The teacher looked at the open hole. "There is no roof, then we make one." She moved the children below grade first. That mattered more than fear. Below grade, the wind would pass over their heads. Debris was the killer now. Lila looked at the schoolhouse door beam. 16 feet of milled pine. The best timber Gray had sold to anyone in town. Hollis had said it himself. Hollis arrived on a crutch and saw where she was looking. "If you pull that lintel, the front wall comes down." "The front wall is coming down anyway," Lila said. He looked at the wall. He heard the roof nails complaining. Then he handed her his pry bar. They rigged Silas's block and tackle to the beam. Hollis cut the pegs. Lila and the blacksmith pulled. The nails shrieked free. The beam dropped. The schoolhouse sagged. They dragged the timber across the trench and laid it over the opening. One beam became a spine, doors, benches, loose boards, and finished ribs, not a finished roof, not a proper roof. Enough. The storm hit while Lila was still wedging the last rail with a broken wagon spoke. Rain fell sideways. The schoolhouse front wall collapsed 30 seconds after the children left it. The roof folded inward where the teacher's desk had been. In the trench, children screamed as boards struck the makeshift cover above them. The cover bowed, held, bowed again, held. Water ran to the low corner where Elsie, now 13 and with Lila's flat calm in her face, was already digging a crude sump with both hands. The storm lasted 40 minutes. When it passed, the children were soaked, shaking, and alive. Peter Lamb stood in the rain, looking at the collapsed schoolhouse. Then he looked at Lila. "My family digs first," he said, voice carrying across the mud. "Walls second." No one argued, not even Gray. That was how the rule changed. Not by vote, not by law, by weather. A cabin could come later, a painted front could come later, a parlor window, a stove shelf, a porch, a fence, all of it could come later. But on that prairie, the first room was the one the wind could not find. Hollis began building cabins with cellar hatches that opened inward, lower roof lines, reinforced corners, no false fronts. He wrote Lila's measurements on the first page of his notebook, even though she told him not to. Gray's lumber still sold, but not like before. He could sell boards. He could not sell fear back to people who had learned the ground, was already holding the first answer. The original survey wagon stayed where Lila had buried it. Grass rooted through the sod cap until the shelter looked less like a thing built than a decision the Prairie had accepted. Children were told not to jump on it, not because it was weak, because it was not empty ground. It was where 13 people had listened to the wind pass overhead and learned that survival did not always look like standing tall. Noah survived the winter. The still air below grade gave his lungs time to heal. Elsie grew into the work until men twice her size waited for her to inspect their sump angles. She could hear a bad vent by its note. She could tell a shallow ramp by the way a person leaned when carrying weight down it. She became the one families sent for when two things happened at once: a baby coming, a sky changing. Lila grew older at the west edge of Prairie Bend, where she could see the weather before town dust touched it. Her hands stiffened, her eyes dimmed, but she could still set her palm to a clay wall and know whether it held. She could still feel the wind turn before the grass admitted it. Years later, after another gale crossed the prairie and found the town lower, wiser, and harder to kill, Lila sat at the entrance of the buried survey wagon with one hand resting on the roof. The painted railroad letters inside had faded under soot and breath. The floor was worn smooth by knees, boots, sleeping children, and frightened adults. Above her, the grass moved in waves. The wind owned everything that stood up and offered itself. It owned false fronts, loose shingles, unchinked seams, proud walls, doors that opened the wrong way. But beneath Lila's palm was oak, clay, sod, weight, and the memory of every hand that had learned to dig before it learned to boast. She remembered the first joke from the road, the grave big enough for herself, and she smiled, because the town had survived for the same reason the wind had failed. The strongest wall on the prairie was the one the storm could not find.